Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, YouTubers. Jerry Diamond, How to Get Out of Babylon. And I'm going to read a chapter, and then I want to do just a update, talk, just reminisce about some more thoughts about my trip, and probably primarily things that that are going on just spiritually that I see. So, alrighty, get started here. Death and Taxes, Part 2. The two men shared a companionable silence for the ride into Gainesville until they passed the Albertsons grocery store, where 24 or more cars could be seen parked out front. Looks like their business is starting to pick up. At least there's more cars out front than I've seen in a while. That's starting to affect you in any way? Miguel studied the store for a moment while they waited for their light to change. No, very little actually. It's 10 miles from Archer to Gainesville, and many cannot afford the gasoline to come into town to shop, so they come to me. Besides, I sell many locally produced foods, such as the baked goods your girls make for me. These big chain stores have difficulty in doing that, being very dependent on centrally located distribution warehouses. In time, perhaps, that will change and they will become more competitive, but then they would more closely resemble me than I would resemble them. Some foods we must all import from far away: coffee, sugar, tea, spices, and other such products. But shipping is now very expensive. This greatly impacts the prices one must charge in order to make a profit. So long as fuel remains costly, it will be cost competitive to produce more things nearby, even if the climate isn't quite as conducive for doing so as it is somewhere else much further away. John nodded his head. You're right about the fuel, at least. If I had to pay road fuel prices for my ag diesel, I wouldn't be able to farm at all. This is going to cause a serious change in the way agriculture in America works if fuel stays expensive for a long while. And it sure looks like it's going to, with many of the Persian Gulf states cutting back on their output to keep prices high. This is true, John, but were it not for their actions, short-sighted in my eyes, many of the alternative fuel technologies now starting to blossom, such as your methane digester, would not be cost-effective. Perhaps Sheikh Saladin believes he is tormenting us, but I think he is actually doing us a great favor. There will be pain, yes, as our economy adjusts to the new reality, but we will surely learn to stand more strongly upon our own resources than his. The people must still eat. They want a way to stay warm, and they have light to see by, so they will spend their money on those things, even if it means they cannot buy a new car as often as they'd like, or see the latest Hollywood production as often as they'd prefer. John stopped for another red light. With so little traffic these days, why did they keep so many in use? And rubbed the back of his neck. Hell, I don't care if gas goes to $1. 10 cents a gallon. We're going to go right on using that gas digester regardless. As long as I can grow grass and corn and have stock to eat it, I'll have the raw material to produce my own fuel. If I could produce my own fuel for vehicular use, I'd do that as well. Unfortunately, no one's come up with a very efficient way to use methane for mobile use. Molecular weight is too light. I'd really like one of those diesel-electric hybrids they've been talking about in the news lately. They showed one last night in a Nova documentary rigged up as a half-ton pickup truck. They didn't mention any prices, but I imagine they'd be steep. Wouldn't surprise me if they went for $2,000 or more. That would be $20,000. Miguel smiled. Mark Holloway owns the Ford agency up to Alachua. We've shot doves together on his father's farm. I'll ask him what he hears from Detroit about these vehicles. The light turned and they pulled through, heading downtown. It still surprised him to see the tall gallows scaffold in front of the courthouse, even though he'd already witnessed one hanging. In spite of the light, steady rain and occasional gusty wind, a crowd of about 60 people had gathered to witness the execution. Much like the execution of Archie Lauren that had come before, half the crowd Much like the execution of Archie Lauren that had come before, about half the crowd were black. There had actually been very little racial violence in Gainesville itself, but this had not stopped rumors from running like wildfire through the black and white communities about what one group or another was plotting to do. The two men got out of the truck, put on their rain slickers, snugged down their hats, and joined the crowd. A bailiff passing through the crowd recognized John and said, "Good morning, Deputy Horn," on his way to the courthouse. Around him he could hear muted whispering starting to spread as the fact of his identity began to circulate. Couldn't be helped, so he ignored it. After about 10 minutes, a slow drum began to play and the gathered spectators fell silent. John wondered again why the prison system felt the need for such martial-sounding music, but supposed it worked as well as anything to let the crowd know how to behave by cueing them on what was about to happen. A few seconds after the drum sounded, the doors from the bottom of the courthouse opened, and an assembly of corrections officers marched out, not all of them managing to stay in step, with the hooded executioner leading and the condemned man in the middle. John studied him closely. He looked now less like the murderous Klansman he'd been on the day of the shootout than he did a frightened and bewildered young man. His hair was cut very close, and he could see a large purple bruise on his right temple that had not been there when he'd last seen him on the day of his trial. The drum continued its funeral cadence as the assemblage crossed the distance from the doors to the gallows, between a cordon of deputies keeping the assembled watchers at a distance. On top of the courthouse and the city offices facing it, he could see Sheriff Department riflemen prominently poised to discourage any interference in the proceedings. When the executioner reached the bottom of the steps, the drum music made a minute but noticeable change to its cadence, and they began to ascend the 13 steps. John tried to recall the significance behind that number of steps on a gallows, but it would not come to him. 13 loops on the noose, the hangman's noose. That's one. 13 is bad luck. 13 is rebellion. Sorry, I'm trying not to comment. I'm tired. At the top, the officers stood. At the top, the officer stood. Redmond read out the charges that he'd been convicted of. At the top, the officer stood Redmond on the short platform on the deck, facing the noose hanging at just below head level. The guard sergeant read out the charges that he'd been convicted of, the multiple deaths of his clan cohorts, and Melinda's kidnapping being the most grievous of them. Then he read out the sentence that had been passed upon him by the court. When he finished, he asked the young man if he had any final words, and with a barely perceptible shake of his head, he indicated he did not. How different this one is, John thought, compared to Archie Loren, who had glared at the crowd and gave his last words a poison-filled diatribe against the nation's Zog-controlled government, Zionist-occupied government, mud people, and blank numbers in general, until at last the sergeant had silenced him. The difference between the true believer and a young man who had not yet completely sold his soul to fanaticism and now realizes too late the consequences of his actions. The sergeant stepped back, and a man in a clerical collar came forward with a Bible in his hands. He and the young man bowed their heads and prayed, earnestness written across the face of the condemned. Finally, the prayer was finished, and the holy man stepped back. The young man's face came up, resigned to his fate, and clear-eyed now. He looked over the crowd, coming, it seemed, straight to John, where they locked eyes for a moment until the executioner brought the black hood down over his head and carefully placed the noose, snugging it up to keep it from shifting. Loren had done the same thing, finding and locking eyes with John out of a crowd of people numbering seemingly several hundred. He had refused the hood, shouting loudly that he wanted to look at his murderers as he died. And so he had, staring at John the entire time until the rope lifted him off the platform, after which he never saw anything in this world again. Perhaps we'll meet again someday, John thought, but at least you'll have gotten there before me. The executioner stepped back now, placing his hand on the ring pin, holding up the carefully weighted sandbag, and looked at the guard officer. Suddenly the drums rolled, and the officer nodded his head, and the executioner gave the ring a small part from its socket, releasing the sandbag into its long, long fall that would jerk Redmond out of the world and into the next before it came to rest at the end of its rope. The sound of a thump could be heard when the bag hit its bottom, and upon the scaffold the hooded figure turned slightly in the breeze, seeming to look more fully upon John, its legs twitching. The crowd stood silently for a few moments, looking upward. Then, without speaking, John and Miguel turned and began to walk back to the truck, stripping off their slickers when they reached it. After they'd got in and cranked the motor, its welcome warmth playing over them from the heater vents, John said, with luck and by the grace of God, that's the last one of those I'll ever feel the need to watch. Miguel said nothing for a moment, then replied, my friend, I devoutly hope this to be true. Witnessing more than very few such events as that, I believe, would be very corrosive to the soul. Pulling out onto the main road, they headed toward East Gainesville and the Recovery Corps salvage yards to find the materials they needed to build a better life for those who still retained it. All right. Thank you. One more chapter down. We're getting toward the end. It's, what is that page? Should show it somewhere. Not seeing it. 224, about 25 pages left. So, alrighty. Good night. Thank you all. Bye-bye.